Who carried the message that changed the course of the American Revolution? Not the message that was printed in newspapers, the one written in invisible ink between the lines of what looked like an ordinary business letter. Who loaded the boats that carried Washington's army across the Delaware? Who stitched torn uniforms before another march? Who baked the bread? Who printed the Declaration of Independence through the night so it could be read aloud the next morning? Who taught starving soldiers at Valley Forge how to prepare the food that had finally reached camp? Those aren't the questions we usually ask. History usually points us toward the people standing in the middle of the painting: Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, Cornwallis. But every one of those famous moments sits on top of something much larger: a communication network, a supply chain, an intelligence operation, an international alliance. Thousands of people, most of whom never met one another, solving thousands of ordinary problems that somehow added up to one extraordinary outcome. When you picture the American Revolution, you probably picture a battle. This episode is about everything happening just outside the frame. Because battles don't organize themselves, armies don't feed themselves, declarations don't distribute themselves, and countries don't coordinate themselves. So today, instead of retelling the American Revolution, I want to pull back the curtain. Because behind every famous revolutionary moment, there's another story that's usually invisible. So let's rewind and let's get into it. Now, if we're going to pull back the curtain on the American Revolution, I think we have to start with one of the most famous documents in American history, the Declaration of Independence. It's one of those moments that almost feels too familiar. Thomas Jefferson sits down to write. The Continental Congress debates the language. The delegates approve it. 56 men eventually sign their names, and America declares its independence. That's the story most of us know, and that is the story. But the more I thought about it, the more one question kept bothering me. Why did anyone care? And I don't mean that sarcastically, I mean literally. Imagine Thomas Jefferson writes those exact same words, but he writes them in 1771 instead of 1776. Imagine he walks into Philadelphia and unrolls the parchment and announces that the colonies are now independent. Who exactly is listening? Would Massachusetts immediately agree? Would Virginia? Would South Carolina? Or would each colony simply shrug and think, who made you the spokesperson for all of us? Because declarations don't create unity. They assume it already exists. And in the early 1770s, that assumption would have been a bold one. There wasn't a United States. There were 13 separate British colonies. Each had its own legislature and governor and economy and priorities. Most colonists thought of themselves first as Virginians or New Yorkers or Massachusetts men before they thought of themselves as Americans. Creating a shared political identity across those colonial boundaries became one of the Revolution's greatest achievements, not one of its starting conditions. So before anyone could declare independence, before anyone could fight together, before anyone could imagine becoming one country, they had to solve a much simpler problem. How do you get 13 separate colonies to start paying attention to one another? The first answer was communication. In 1772, Boston established what became the first enduring committee of correspondence under Samuel Adams and other Patriot leaders. The idea was remarkably simple. If something important happened in Boston, don't let it stay in Boston. Write about it and send it, and ask another town to respond. Then encourage that town to do the same. Before long, similar committees spread throughout the colony, creating an intercolonial communication network unlike anything British North America had seen before. Thousands of local leaders eventually served on these committees, exchanging letters and coordinating responses, and helping lay the groundwork for continental resistance. I love this because, on paper, it sounds really ordinary. A committee. Honestly, it sounds like the least exciting thing imaginable. Nobody paints committee meetings. Nobody hangs a portrait of someone folding letters. Nobody builds a monument to the courier who spent 3 days on horseback carrying a packet of correspondence from Boston to Philadelphia. But that's exactly where the revolution began, learning how to think together. Imagine you're a printer in Philadelphia. A courier arrives carrying letters from Massachusetts. You set the type and the presses begin rolling. By morning, people are reading about events that happened hundreds of miles away. A traveler folds the newspaper into his saddlebag and carries it farther south. Someone reads it aloud in a tavern that evening. A local committee copies the most important parts and sends another letter to the next town. Then the whole process starts over again. Not for days, but for years. And slowly, something begins to change. Boston's problems don't feel quite so local anymore. People hundreds of miles away begin recognizing the same patterns, the same frustrations, the same arguments. The colonies are still politically separate, but they're beginning to develop something they didn't really have before, which is a shared conversation. But even through all that, communication wasn't enough. Knowing what was happening didn't automatically tell people what to do next. Once committees agreed that Parliament had become the problem, another question immediately appeared. Now what? Who enforces the boycotts? Who decides whether a merchant is honoring them? Who recruits militia? Who collects supplies? Who watches for the loyalist activity? Who keeps daily life functioning while royal authority is beginning to disappear? That's where another layer of hidden infrastructure quietly emerges. Committees of inspection, committees of observation, committees of safety. The names varied from colony to colony, but their purpose became remarkably similar. They began by enforcing the Continental Association, the sweeping boycott of British goods adopted by the First Continental Congress, but they quickly expanded far beyond that. They monitored trade, organized militia, collected supplies, raised funds, identified loyalist activity, and in many communities became the practical local government long before independence was officially declared. Historian T.H. Breen argues that these committees created one of the Revolution's first formal organizational structures capable of coordinating resistance across local communities. That really stopped me, because we usually imagine the Revolution replacing one government with another, but that's not quite what happened. Before the old government disappeared, ordinary people had already started building a new one underneath it. So even if every committee did its job perfectly, the boycott still wouldn't work unless ordinary families actually changed the way they lived. Who decided whether British tea was served at dinner? Who decided whether imported cloth would still be purchased? Who decided whether the household would participate in the boycott? More often than not, women did. One of the quietest revolutions taking place during these years wasn't happening in Congress, it was happening in kitchens. Across the colonies, women organized spinning circles, produced homespun cloth, shared techniques for replacing imported goods, and turned everyday household decisions into political acts. Refusing to buy British textiles wasn't just an economic decision anymore. It became a public statement that the household supported a patriot cause. The committees could encourage resistance, but thousands of women made that resistance real through the choices they made every single day. I love that image because nobody would have thought they were making history at the time. They were just spinning yarn and sewing clothes and making tea and shopping for their families. And yet, taken together, these ordinary decisions became part of the revolution's infrastructure. Communication created awareness, the committees created organization, and households created participation. Only when all three were working together did something like the Declaration of Independence become possible and believable, because by July of 1776, Jefferson wasn't writing into silence. John Dunlap printed the first broadsides almost immediately after Congress approved the Declaration. Couriers carried them from town to town. Printers reprinted them. Churches read them aloud. Militia camps heard them, and town meetings debated them. They spread through a communication system, an organizational system, and a population that had already spent years learning to act together. And that's the part of the story that I never really fully appreciated. The Declaration didn't create the movement, it gave the movement a voice. So, what other famous moments in the Revolution were resting on invisible foundations we almost never notice? Let's talk about Washington crossing the Delaware. It's one of the most recognizable images in American history. You know the painting. Washington standing heroically at the front of the boat, ice floating around him, and the flag waving dramatically behind him, even though historians are quick to point out that flag didn't even actually exist yet. It's an incredible painting, but paintings have a habit of doing something. They crop. They show us exactly what the artist wants us to see, which is fair. They quietly leave everything else outside of the frame. Because if you widen the camera just a little, the crossing starts looking less like one heroic moment and more like one enormous logistical puzzle. Think about what Washington was actually trying to do. He wasn't rowing a few soldiers across a quiet river. He was trying to move roughly 2,400 soldiers with horses and artillery and ammunition and supplies across an icy, fast-moving river on Christmas night in miserable weather, while keeping the entire operation secret from an enemy only a few miles away. Every cannon had to make it across. Every wagon had to end up on the correct side of the river. Every delay increased the risk that daylight would expose the operation before the army ever reached Trenton. This isn't just bold leadership, it's major coordination. And just like the Declaration, the more I looked at the famous moment, the more interested I became in everything that happened beforehand. The first problem was surprisingly simple. Where do you find enough boats to move an army? Washington didn't have a military fleet waiting for him. Instead, local militia, Pennsylvania officials, and civilians spent days gathering every suitable vessel they could find from communities along the Delaware River. Large ferry boats were assembled for the horses and artillery, while commercial freight vessels known as Durham boats were pressed into military service. These weren't warships, they were cargo boats that had spent years hauling iron and grain and supplies up and down the Delaware. Now they were about to carry the future of the Revolution. I love that detail because it reminds us that revolutions rarely begin with brand new systems. More often, they borrow existing ones. The revolution didn't invent transportation, but it definitely repurposed it. But then another question occurred. Even if you've somehow gathered enough bows, who actually knows how to operate them? Because owning a freight boat and navigating one across an ice-filled river in the middle of a snowstorm are two very different things. That's where Colonel John Glover enters the story. Most people have never heard of him. Washington certainly had. Before the Revolution, Glover had been a merchant and a mariner from Marblehead, Massachusetts. His regiment wasn't made up primarily of farmers who had suddenly become soldiers. Many of the men were fishermen and sailors and shipbuilders and professional watermen who had spent their lives working at sea. Washington had already relied on them to evacuate the Continental Army from Long Island months earlier. Now he needed them again because this wasn't just a military operation, it was a maritime one. So the revolution wasn't simply won by brave people, it was won by people whose ordinary skills suddenly became extraordinary assets. Printers and boatmen and blacksmiths and surveyors and teamsters. People who probably never imagined that the jobs they'd been doing for years would one day become essential to creating a new nation. But even that wasn't enough because once the boats reached the western shore, the hard part wasn't over. It was actually just the beginning. Someone had to know which roads were passable. Someone had to guide thousands of men through unfamiliar countryside in darkness. Someone had to make sure the artillery didn't fall behind. Someone had to keep the columns moving together despite freezing rain, turning to sleet and then snow. And someone had to make sure the soldiers arrived with enough ammunition and food to fight immediately after marching for miles in terrible weather. They carried 3 days' rations and 60 rounds of ammunition per man, while Henry Knox oversaw the successful movement of the artillery across the river despite the worsening conditions. Henry Knox doesn't usually get top billing in this story either, but he probably should. Moving cannons across an icy river without losing a single artillery piece wasn't just impressive, but it was indispensable. Washington could surprise the Hessians all he wanted. Without artillery, the attack looks very different. Then there's one more detail I absolutely love. The plan almost fell apart. The weather was worse than anyone expected. The crossing took hours longer than planned. Two supporting columns never made it across the river at all. Washington suddenly found himself attacking with fewer men than he had intended, and yet he kept going. That's another piece of infrastructure we don't talk about enough: adaptability. We often imagine successful operations unfolding exactly according to plan. History is usually much messier than that. Good systems don't eliminate problems, but they survive them. Washington's crossing worked because dozens of different people kept solving problems as new ones appeared. Boatmen adapted to the river, and officers adapted to the delays. Artillery crews adapted to the weather, and guides adapted to changing conditions on the road. Nobody woke up that morning expecting the operation to unfold exactly as planned. They woke up expecting to solve problems. By the time Washington's army reached Trenton, history remembers a brilliant military victory, and it was. But I don't think the real miracle happened in Trenton. It happened hours earlier, when thousands of people with completely different skills somehow managed to move an entire army across an icy river in darkness without losing their nerve. Because before there could be a famous victory, there first had to be an invisible system capable of getting everyone to the battlefield. Now let's talk about what could be perhaps the biggest infrastructure challenge of the entire revolution: Valley Forge. This wasn't about winning a battle, but keeping an army alive. When most of us picture Valley Forge, we picture suffering and snow and bare feet and thin blankets. Hungry soldiers huddled around campfires. It's become one of the defining images of endurance in American history. And to be fair, those images aren't wrong. Thousands of soldiers endured terrible hardship during the winter of 77 and 78. Disease swept through the camp, and food was inconsistent. Clothing was scarce. George Washington warned Congress that unless something changed, the army might, quote, starve, dissolve, or disperse. But as I'd been doing throughout this episode, I found myself asking a different question. Why? Why was an army surrounded by farmland starving? At first glance, it doesn't make much sense. Valley Forge wasn't in the middle of a frozen wilderness. It sat on one of Pennsylvania's richest agricultural regions. Farmers nearby had wheat and livestock and flour, but the problem was getting it to the people who needed it. That completely changed how I thought about Valley Forge. This wasn't simply a story about scarcity, it was about logistics. By the winter of 1777, Washington wasn't just commanding an army anymore, he was trying to run a city, essentially. Roughly 12,000 soldiers occupied the encampment, and once you add officers and artisans and women and children and support personnel, the population grew even larger. Historians have noted that the original complexity of supplying an army this size rivaled that of managing a small city. Think about everything a city needs every single day. There's food and water, of course, there's firewood and medical care, transportation, waste removal, shelter, and now imagine trying to provide all of that without trucks or railroads or refrigeration, without a reliable national government. Suddenly, Valley Forge doesn't look like a military story anymore. It looks like an enormous supply chain problem. Someone had to negotiate with farmers, or inspect the flour, or locate wagons. Someone had to repair harnesses. Someone had to shoe horses. Someone had to keep roads open after storms. Someone had to know which bridges were still standing. If any one of these pieces failed, the entire system began to break down, and many of them did. Congress had reorganized parts of the quartermaster department, but responsibilities became fragmented. Transportation faltered, and no one seemed to have clear authority over the entire supply system. Food spoiled before reaching camp. Wagons failed to arrive. Roads became impassable. The problem wasn't simply producing supplies, it was coordinating them. Historian Wayne Bodle argues the Continental Army's growing size made it especially vulnerable to logistical disruption. But here's something I had almost never thought about. Once the food finally reached Valley Forge, who actually turned it into meals? Who washed thousands of uniforms? Who cared for sick soldiers? Who mended torn clothing and who hauled the water? Who looked after children while the army prepared for another campaign? The answer wasn't always soldiers. Hundreds of women lived alongside the Continental Army throughout the encampment. Some were wives, and some had followed husbands or relatives into military service. Others earned money by laundering clothes and nursing the sick, sewing uniforms, or preparing food. George Washington sometimes complained that camp followers complicated military movement, yet he also recognized that much of their labor was indispensable. Without them, the army would have been dirtier, sicker, and far less capable of functioning. The famous paintings show soldiers around campfires, but now I imagine someone washing shirts in freezing water, someone baking bread, someone stitching torn coats by candlelight. Nobody painted those moments. But armies don't survive on strategy alone. They survive because ordinary work continues every single day. And then there's another story that almost never gets told. In the spring of 1778, one Oneida woman named Polly Cooper traveled with dozens of Oneida men more than 200 miles to Valley Forge, carrying white corn for the starving Continental Army. Just as importantly, she taught soldiers how to prepare it properly. White corn required a different method of cooking than many of the troops understood, and without that knowledge, it offered far less nourishment. According to Oneida tradition, she refused payment, saying it was simply her duty to help her friends. I absolutely love that story because if this episode is about invisible infrastructure, what could be more invisible than knowledge? It wasn't enough to deliver food, someone had to know how to use it. Finally, there was Nathaniel Greene. Most people remember Greene as one of Washington's best battlefield commanders. Ironically, one of his greatest contributions to the Revolution happened after he accepted a job he didn't even want. In March of 1778, Greene reluctantly became quartermaster general. Working with his staff, he reorganized transportation and improved procurement, and gradually restored the flow of supplies as roads improved and spring reopened river transport. The changes weren't dramatic overnight, but they helped transform a system that had been on the verge of collapse. The more I thought about Valley Forge, the less it felt like a story about suffering. It really became a story about incredible systems. Some failed and some adapted. Some were rebuilt, and together, they kept the Continental Army alive long enough to fight another campaign. Because before the Revolution could win the war, it first had to survive the winter. So the declaration depended on communication, and the crossing depended on transportation with specialized expertise. Valley Forge depended on logistics, but none of those systems by themselves were enough to win the war, because eventually the revolution ran into a problem it simply couldn't solve on its own: the British Navy. Think about it. The colonies had figured out how to communicate. They had figured out how to coordinate, and they had figured out how to keep an army alive through one of the hardest winters, but Britain was still the most powerful naval empire on Earth. As long as British ships could move troops and supplies freely across the Atlantic, the war could continue almost indefinitely. The Revolution had spent years building an army, but it had not built a navy capable of defeating Britons, which meant, sooner or later, the Revolution needed something it couldn't manufacture for itself. It needed allies. Real allies, not people cheering from across the ocean, governments willing to spend money, lend ships, and send actual soldiers, take enormous political and financial risks on behalf of a rebellion that still might fail. And that's where I think we might oversimplify one of the most important relationships in American history. When we tell the story of the French alliance, it usually sounds like this: Benjamin Franklin goes to Paris. He charms the French court. France signs a treaty. French soldiers arrive. Yorktown happens, and it's a great story. It's also missing almost everything that made the alliance work, because an alliance isn't just diplomacy, it's infrastructure. Think about everything that had to happen after the Treaty of Alliance was signed in 78. French ministers had to convince their own government that supporting the American cause was worth the risk of another global war. Loans had to be approved. Weapons had to be manufactured. Ships had to be supplied. Soldiers had to be recruited. Entire fleets had to cross the Atlantic. And after all that, American and French commanders still had to figure out how to fight as one army despite speaking different languages and operating under different military traditions and answering to different governments. Historians increasingly emphasize that turning the Franco-American alliance into an effective military partnership required years of planning and coordination after the treaty itself was signed. Then I started asking the same question I'd been asking throughout this episode: who else made this alliance possible? Not just Ben Franklin. French ministers like Vergennes, who kept the money flowing. Dock workers loading ships in French ports. Shipbuilders repairing fleets. Sailors crossing the Atlantic. Engineers who specialized in siege warfare. Accountants tracking military expenditures. Spanish officials in Havana who helped provide desperately needed hard currency to pay French forces before the Yorktown campaign. None of those people ever met George Washington. Most of them never set foot in North America, and yet they became part of the Revolution's infrastructure. Then, in 1781, everything had to happen almost perfectly. George Washington was outside New York. The Comte de Rochambeau marched thousands of French soldiers to join him. Then, the Marquis de Lafayette kept pressure on Cornwallis and Virginia. Meanwhile, Admiral Francois de Grasse sailed north from the Caribbean with 28 ships of the line and more than 3,000 additional French troops. At almost the same time, Admiral de Barras secretly departed Newport carrying the heavy siege artillery the Allies would need if they actually trapped Cornwallis. None of these forces reported to the same commander. None of them would communicate instantly. Most were operating with incomplete information, and somehow they all arrived within days of one another. Historians have described the Yorktown campaign as one of the greatest coordination achievements of the 18th century. One of my favorite details is that Washington spent weeks convincing the British that New York, not Virginia, was his real objective. False reports circulated. Events were staged, and the British watched Washington and came to exactly the wrong conclusion. While they were preparing to defend New York, the Allied armies quietly marched hundreds of miles south. Coordination wasn't just about getting your own side to the right place, it was also about making sure your opponent coordinated around the wrong plan. And then came the battle that almost nobody remembers. Not Yorktown, but the Battle of Chesapeake. On September 5th, 1781, Admiral de Grasse met the British fleet just outside the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay. Now, it wasn't the largest naval battle of the century. It wasn't even one of the bloodiest, but strategically, it may have been one of the most important. Because once the British fleet withdrew, Cornwallis lost his escape route. No reinforcements or evacuation. The trap closed. Historians have argued that without French control of the Chesapeake, the siege of Yorktown almost certainly fails. And suddenly, I was back where this episode began, standing outside of Yorktown. Only now the picture looked completely different. I wasn't just watching George Washington accept a surrender. I was watching years of invisible coordination finally become visible. Communication networks and local committees, printers and households and boatmen and quartermasters, women washing uniforms and nursing the sick, Oneida allies bringing desperately needed food and knowledge, thousands upon thousands of people, most of whom would never appear in a history painting. Yorktown wasn't remarkable because one army defeated another. It was remarkable because, for perhaps the first time during the Revolution, every one of those invisible systems worked together. And when they finally did, the war was effectively over. So, we've talked about communication and transportation, and logistics and international alliances. But there's one more system we haven't really talked about yet: information. Not communication, but intelligence. Because there's a difference there. Communication is making sure your own side knows what's happening, intelligence is figuring out what the other side is doing. And if communication helped build the revolution, intelligence helped protect it. George Washington understood that almost immediately. In one letter, he wrote, quote, "The necessity of procuring good intelligence is apparent and need not be further urged," end quote. That's such a fascinating sentence to me because it tells us something about the way Washington thought. He wasn't treating espionage as some clever side project. He saw it as infrastructure. It belonged in the same category as food and ammunition and transportation. I'll admit, when I first started researching this episode, I almost skipped over intelligence completely. I thought everybody knows about the spies and the invisible ink and the secret codes, the Culper ring. It's become one of the most famous stories of the revolution, but then I realized I was making exactly the same mistake I've been making the whole time. I was looking at the spies instead of the system. Because the remarkable thing about the Culper ring wasn't that it had code names, it was that it functioned like every other piece of infrastructure we've talked about. It was a network. Think about how difficult this job actually was. New York City was under British occupation. Washington desperately needed to know what British commanders were planning, but he couldn't simply send officers into Manhattan to ask questions. So instead, information moved through an entire chain of people. Someone observed troop movements, and then someone else wrote the report. And then another person disguised it inside an ordinary letter using invisible ink or numerical codes. And then another person, a courier, carried it across Long Island. A boatman ferried it across Long Island Sound. Benjamin Talmadge received it, and then it finally reached George Washington. And here's the part I found fascinating. Washington deliberately organized the network so that many of the participants didn't even know one another's identities. If one courier was captured, the rest of the network could survive. That's not just espionage, that's organizational design. It's resilience. And once I saw that, I started recognizing another pattern. Just like the committees and the quartermasters, the intelligence network depended on ordinary people doing very ordinary jobs extraordinarily well. A merchant who noticed something unusual, a farmer who recognized unfamiliar troop movements, a ferryman willing to cross dangerous waters at night, an innkeeper overhearing conversations, a courier who looked completely forgettable. Those are the kinds of people who make intelligence systems work, not because they're famous, because nobody notices them. And then there's a group we rarely talk about: women. Popular history loves the mysterious story of Agent 355. The problem is, we actually don't know very much about her. Historians still debate who she was or even whether 355 referred to one specific woman. So rather than building the story around a mystery, I think the more interesting truth is that many women became valuable intelligence assets precisely because 18th century society underestimated them. They could visit homes and attend social gatherings and move through occupied cities and carry messages and observe officers and overhear conversations in ways military officers couldn't. It's another example of ordinary life becoming infrastructure. The very assumptions that limited women's formal political roles also made some of them remarkably effective intelligence gatherers. Then there's Benedict Arnold. We usually tell that story as a tragedy. A celebrated American general betrays his country, and that's certainly part of it. But underneath that story is another lesson about systems. Arnold's betrayal wasn't discovered because one person had a lucky hunch. It was uncovered because Washington had spent years investing in an intelligence network capable of connecting seemingly unrelated pieces of information. When British Major John Andre was captured carrying documents related to Arnold's plan to surrender West Point, multiple parts of that network came into play. Militia stopped Andre, officers questioned him, and Talmadge recognized inconsistencies in the story. Information moved quickly enough that Washington was able to secure West Point before Arnold's plot succeeded. Think about how close that came. If West Point falls, the Hudson River is effectively divided. Communication between New England and the rest of the colonies becomes dramatically more difficult. One successful act of espionage could have undone years of infrastructure building. Instead, another infrastructure stopped it: the intelligence network. And I think that's the final curtain this episode pulled back for me. At first, I thought I was researching hidden people, but that's not really what this episode became. It's about hidden capabilities. Communication allowed the colonies to think together, and transportation allowed armies to move. Logistics allowed those armies to survive. International alliances expanded what the revolution was capable of accomplishing. Intelligence protected all of it. Each system solved a different problem, each depended on different people, and none of them by themselves would have been enough. But together, they created something much larger than the sum of their parts. They created the conditions under which a revolution could actually succeed. So let's go back to Yorktown, only this time, look at it a little bit differently. The paintings are still there. Washington is still there, and the surrender still happens. None of that has changed. What has changed is everything we know exists just outside the frame. Behind every cannon is a supply chain. Behind every army is a transportation network. Behind every declaration is years of communication. Behind every military victory is diplomacy and intelligence, finance, local government, household, and thousands of ordinary people solving ordinary problems. That's the story I think the American Revolution has to offer. Not because those systems are unique, but because they're so easy to forget. History has a tendency to compress long processes into single moments. It gives us the Declaration of Independence instead of years of political organizing that made the Declaration meaningful. It gives us Washington crossing the Delaware instead of the transportation network that got an army to the river. It gives us Valley Forge instead of the quartermasters, camp followers, farmers, wagoners, and Oneida allies who kept the army alive. It gives us Yorktown instead of an Atlantic world of diplomats and sailors, engineers and merchants, and soldiers whose efforts somehow converged at exactly the right moment. Moments are easier to remember than systems. People are easier to remember than networks. A painting can capture a surrender, but it can't capture 10 years of coordination. And that's one of the reasons historians have increasingly shifted away from telling the revolution simply as a story of great men and dramatic events. The more scholars have studied local communities, institutions, logistics, and everyday political life, the clearer it's become that the revolution wasn't only fought on battlefields. It was built through relationships and organizations and systems that connected millions of decisions into a single movement. None of that makes Washington less remarkable, or Jefferson or Franklin for that matter. If anything, it makes their accomplishments more impressive, because leadership didn't replace those systems, it depended on them. History remembers the cannon fire, but I think the real miracle is that the cannonballs showed up at all. Thanks for listening to this again. If you enjoyed today's episode, I'd love it if you'd leave a rating or review wherever you're listening from. It really does help more people discover the show. And if this episode changed the way you look at the American Revolution, send it to someone who loves history. Because once you start looking beyond the famous moments, it's surprisingly hard to stop. And one last note, I was recording during a major thunderstorm, and I apologize if you hear any thunder or crazy sounds in the background. There was just no getting around it. It was going nonstop. So thanks for bearing with me, and happy Independence Day to my fellow Americans. I'll see you next time.